Welcome to Bookbound Audio, where stories come alive through words and imagination. Today, we invite you to journey with us into the haunting depths of Cypress Hollow, a remote Louisiana swamp steeped in sorrow, mystery, and shadows. Presenting The Lament of Black Willow, a spine-chilling horror mystery thriller filled with suspense, folklore, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. Sit back, relax, or perhaps brace yourself, and let the tale of Willow Fournier unravel. Let's begin. The murmur of Cypress Hollow seemed to whisper through the peeling clapboards of its homes as we arrived. It wasn't the kind of town you might pass through by accident, set far from any major roads, nestled between endless fields of sugarcane and the forbidding embrace of the swamp. The air, laden with the scent of damp earth and stagnant water, wrapped itself around my senses and refused to let go. It was early afternoon, yet the sky appeared unnaturally dim, as though the town lived under the constant threat of twilight. Elliot was already scanning our surroundings with his sharp eyes, his coat flapping lightly in the humid breeze. I'd seen him in countless investigations, stepping into scenes of tragedy with a calm precision that both unnerved and reassured. Here, though, there was something different in his demeanor, a guardedness, as if the swamp itself bore down upon his usual unshakable confidence. "Strange place for strange stories," Elliot remarked as he leaned against the rusting metal gate leading into Cypress Hollow's modest square. His voice cut through the stillness like a blade. "You catch that smell, Miguel?" I nodded, though he didn't look at me. "Damp," I replied. "Old. Like the earth itself is rotting." Elliot tilted his head, as though the air could speak its secrets if he listened long enough. "No, it's something heavier. It carries intent." I would have dismissed his cryptic observation as his usual theatrics if not for the peculiar heaviness in my chest. Whether it was the swamp or the tales of Black Willow, I couldn't deny that something oppressive lingered in the atmosphere. Our first stop was the local sheriff's office, a squat wooden structure that had seen better days. Sheriff Caleb Fontaine greeted us with a scowl, his hat pulled low over his weathered face. He was a man who had clearly spent too much of his life battling things he didn't understand, but there was a tension in his frame that spoke to something new, something that had shaken even him. "I appreciate you coming out," he said, his Louisiana drawl thick but steady. "Lord knows we need all the help we can get." Elliot offered a polite nod, though I knew he wasn't one for pleasantries. "What can you tell me about the deaths?" The sheriff sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Nothing good. People dropping like flies, always near the swamp. They're found with this look of pure terror on their faces. And then there's the marks, like someone carved symbols into their skin." His voice faltered, as though the words themselves carried a curse. Elliot's interest was piqued. He leaned forward slightly, a predator closing in on prey. "Symbols?" Sheriff Fontaine nodded. "Can't make sense of it, Em. We got one of the bodies at the morgue if you're brave enough to look." I exchanged a glance with Elliot. Brave enough? I might have laughed under different circumstances, but the heaviness of the air and the sheriff's somber tone silenced any inclination for humor. The morgue was a grim affair, just a single room at the back of the town's clinic, with an ancient refrigerator that hummed like a dying animal. The sheriff pulled back the sheet from the corpse of a man named Louis Boudreau, whose pale face stared at the ceiling with frozen horror. I felt my stomach churn, but Elliot remained composed as always. "What do you see, Miguel?" he asked, his voice low but commanding. It was his way of forcing me to focus, to ground myself in the investigation. I hesitated, then leaned closer. Louis' skin bore deep carvings across his chest and arms, intricate and deliberate. They resembled no language I had seen, but the shape of the symbols reminded me of glyphs I had come across in old folklore texts. There was something ritualistic about them, as though they carried a purpose beyond mere brutality. "They're old," I murmured. "Not random. Whoever did this, they knew exactly what they were doing." Elliot nodded approvingly, then turned his attention back to the sheriff. "You mentioned the singing." Sheriff Fontaine shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, locals say they hear a woman's voice out in the swamp before it happens. The victims, they all heard it, too, right before." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. It wasn't the first time I'd heard stories of spirits or banshees announcing death through their cries, but something about this felt different. More personal. More dangerous. The sheriff led us to the edge of the swamp later that afternoon, though he refused to venture further. "You don't want to go in there," he warned. "Not at night, and not ever if you've got sense." Elliot didn't flinch. He adjusted his coat, his jaw set with determination. "Good thing we've got something stronger than sense." I wished I shared his confidence. As we stepped into the swamp, the environment shifted around us. The trees loomed like shadowy guardians, their gnarled roots stretching into dark pools of stagnant water. The buzzing of insects filled the air, mingling with the faint rustling of leaves. And then there was the silence, the uncanny stillness that seemed to follow us, as though the swamp itself was watching our every move. "Stay close, Miguel," Elliot said, his voice steady but cautious. "And keep your eyes open." I did as he said, though my instinct screamed to turn back. The swamp was labyrinthine, its paths winding endlessly through the murky landscape. Every so often, I caught glimpses of strange carvings in the bark of the trees, symbols not unlike those we had seen on Louis's body. Elliot paused, crouching to examine the ground. "Tracks," he muttered. "Someone's been here recently." Before I could respond, a faint sound reached my ears, the distant, mournful singing of a woman. It was haunting, beautiful in its sorrow, yet utterly chilling. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "You hear it, don't you?" Elliot asked, his tone dark with understanding. I nodded, unable to form words. The singing grew louder, enveloping the swamp like a ghostly embrace. I felt my chest tighten, the heaviness returning tenfold. It wasn't just fear, it was grief, overwhelming and suffocating. Elliot motioned for me to follow as he pressed further into the swamp, his movements deliberate but cautious. The singing seemed to guide us, leading us deeper into the heart of its domain. I wanted to stop, to run, but my feet moved as though compelled by some unseen force. We reached a small clearing where the swamp opened up to reveal an ancient tree, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky like skeletal arms. At its base lay a pile of stones, weathered and moss-covered, arranged in what appeared to be a crude marker. Elliot knelt by the stones, his expression unreadable. "She was hanged here," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I stared at the marker, my mind racing. This was it, the place where Black Willow had met her fate. The air felt heavier than ever, charged with a palpable energy that made my skin crawl. The singing stopped. Silence enveloped the clearing, and for a moment, I thought I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Then, without warning, the ground beneath the marker shifted, and a burst of cold air swept through the clearing. Elliot stood, his jaw set with determination. "We're not alone." And in that moment, I realized that whatever we had come looking for, it had found us first. The silence after the singing was deafening, as though the swamp itself held its breath. I remained frozen, my feet sinking slightly into the spongy earth beneath me, while Elliot moved with practiced precision toward the pile of stones. His movements were calm, deliberate, yet there was an energy in his posture, a kind of taut anticipation that told me he sensed something far more significant here than just a crude marker. I glanced around the clearing, unable to shake the feeling that we were being watched. The dense foliage cast long, twisted shadows that seemed to writhe in the fading light, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig sent a jolt of anxiety through my chest. This swamp was alive, not in the way nature typically breathes and grows, but in a sinister, knowing way. It bore witness to every movement we made, every whispered word between us. "Look at this," Elliot called, his voice low but insistent. He knelt beside the stones, brushing away the moss and damp earth with his gloved hands to reveal shallow carvings etched into several of the rocks. The symbols were unfamiliar to me, but their shapes carried an unmistakable weight, as if they held meaning older than the swamp itself. "What do you make of them?" he asked without looking up. I crouched beside him, studying the markings closely. They were crude yet deliberate, their lines forming jagged patterns that sent a shiver down my spine. Though I couldn't identify the exact origin, their resemblance to glyphs I'd seen in texts about ancient Creole rituals was undeniable. "They're protective symbols," I said finally, my voice quieter than I'd intended. "Or at least, they were meant to be. This marker, it's not just a grave. It's a boundary." Elliot's brow furrowed, and for a moment he said nothing, his fingers tracing the edge of one of the carvings. "A boundary," he repeated, more to himself than to me. His gaze shifted toward the tree overhead, its gnarled branches draped with Spanish moss that swayed gently despite the stillness of the air. To keep something in, or to keep something out? I didn't have an answer, but the weight of his question settled over me like the damp air of the swamp. Before I could speak again, a sharp crack of wood echoed through the clearing, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps splashing through shallow water. My head snapped up, and I turned toward the direction of the noise. "Who's there?" Elliot called out, his voice firm but calm, betraying none of the unease I felt tightening in my chest. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was only silence, thick and oppressive. Then, emerging from the shadows of the trees, a figure stepped into view. It was an old woman, her frame hunched and wiry, her face obscured by the wide brim of a tattered hat. She carried a gnarled walking stick, its surface worn smooth by years of use, and her dark eyes glittered with an intelligence that felt almost predatory. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice raspy and low, yet carrying an edge of authority that made it clear she was no stranger to confrontation. Elliot rose to his full height, his imposing presence as steady as ever. "And you are?" he asked, his tone measured and polite but unmistakably probing. The woman's gaze shifted to me for a brief moment before returning to Elliot. "Agnes Duval," she said simply. "And this isn't a place for strangers." Agnes Duval. The name struck a chord in my memory, though it took a moment for the connection to surface. She was the recluse the sheriff had mentioned, the old woman who lived on the outskirts of town, known for her peculiar habits and whispered rumors of ties to the occult. "We're here investigating the deaths," I said, stepping forward despite the unease prickling at the back of my neck. "We believe they're connected to the singing, the legend of Black Willow." At the mention of the name, Agnes's expression darkened, and her grip on the walking stick tightened. For a moment, I thought she might turn and leave, but instead, she took a step closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The swamp remembers," she said, her words laden with a cryptic weight. "And it doesn't forgive." "What does that mean?" Elliot pressed, his eyes narrowing slightly. Agnes hesitated, her gaze flickering to the marker at the base of the tree before returning to us. Willow's pain runs deep, deeper than you can imagine. It's written in the water, in the roots, in the very air you're breathing now. And every step you take here brings you closer to her sorrow. Is that what killed those people? Elliot asked, his tone sharp yet steady. Willow's sorrow? Agnes didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked past us, her eyes seeming to focus on something far beyond the physical world. She sings for them, she said finally. For all of us. But some don't just hear the song, they feel it. And that's when they're lost. I felt a chill run down my spine at her words, and I glanced at Elliot, who remained as still and unshaken as ever. You know something, he said, his voice firm but not unkind. Something that could help us stop this. Agnes's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might refuse. But then she sighed, a sound heavy with resignation, and turned toward the shadows of the swamp. Come, she said, motioning for us to follow. There's something you need to see. Elliot and I exchanged a brief glance before falling into step behind her, our boots squelching against the damp earth as we moved deeper into the swamp. The air grew colder as we walked, and the oppressive stillness seemed to close in around us. Agnes moved with a surprising swiftness for someone her age, her stick tapping against the ground with a rhythmic certainty that made it clear she knew this place well. After what felt like an eternity, we arrived at a small clearing where a dilapidated cabin stood, its walls warped and weathered by time. Agnes gestured toward it without a word, her expression unreadable. This is where it began, she said finally. Where Willow's life ended, and where her curse was born. Elliot stepped forward, his eyes scanning the cabin with the practiced precision of a man who had seen more than his fair share of darkness. What happened here? He asked. Agnes didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into the folds of her tattered shawl and produced a small, weathered book, its leather cover cracked and faded with age. She held it out to Elliot, her hand trembling slightly. Her story, she said. Written in her own words. Elliot took the book carefully, his brow furrowing as he opened it to the first page. The writing was faint but legible, the ink smudged in places as though by tears. He scanned the words in silence, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. I watched him closely, my chest tightening with anticipation. Whatever lay within those pages, I knew it held the key to the mysteries we had only just begun to uncover. And as the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of Willow's mournful song, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the precipice of something far greater and far more dangerous than we had ever imagined. The swamp didn't feel the same after that encounter with Agnes Duval. The heaviness had deepened, sinking its claws into the air itself, as if the trees and water wanted to warn us away from venturing any further. Yet Elliot showed no sign of retreat, his focus sharpened by the journal clutched tightly in his gloved hands. We'd returned to the inn after leaving the cabin, but sleep proved elusive. The damp Louisiana night wrapped the building in a suffocating grip, and the faint echoes of Willow's singing seemed to linger just beyond earshot. My own thoughts churned with the weight of what we'd learned. Willow's story, her betrayal, her pain, felt almost tangible now, as if her anguish was etched into the very fabric of Cypress Hollow. Elliot broke the silence before dawn, his voice steady but low. We're going back to the morgue. I sat up, groggy but unsurprised. Why? The symbols, he said simply. They match the ones carved into her journal. I need to know why. The morgue was colder this time, or perhaps my own dread made it feel so. Sheriff Fontaine was waiting, his face marked with the weariness of a man who hadn't slept in days. He led us back to Louis Boudreau's body, the deep carvings on the corpse now more vivid in the sterile morgue light. Elliot wasted no time, placing the journal beside the body and carefully flipping through its pages. The glyphs inside were complex, jagged, yet disturbingly precise. I tried not to dwell on the thought that these same carvings might have been scratched onto Willow's skin before her death. "They're connected," Elliot muttered after several minutes. His tone carried the weight of certainty. "These symbols weren't random, they're part of a ritual." Sheriff Fontaine stepped closer, his face pale. "You mean someone's been repeating her curse?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. His focus remained locked on the journal, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. "No," he said eventually. "Not repeating. Amplifying." The implications were chilling, but the sheriff's radio crackled before we could delve deeper. A garbled voice called for his immediate attention, reporting another death at the edge of the swamp. Fontaine swore under his breath before leading us to his patrol car. The scene was painfully familiar. Another victim, a young woman this time, lay sprawled in the grass, her face contorted in terror and her arms marked with those same ominous carvings. Elliot crouched beside her, his movements careful but deliberate. The sheriff stood to the side, his hands trembling as he tried to light a cigarette. "She heard the singing," Fontaine murmured, his voice hollow. "Her neighbors said she mentioned it right before she went out." Elliot's brow furrowed as he examined the body. "Miguel, look at this." I stepped closer, swallowing hard as I saw what he pointed to. The carvings weren't just symbols this time, they formed a sequence, a progression that seemed to align with the ritual described in Willow's journal. Each glyph carried a sense of purpose, as though it had been added with a specific intent. "It's incomplete," Elliot said. "Whoever's doing this, they haven't finished what they started." The investigation took us deeper into the swamp later that day. Sheriff Fontaine refused to join us, his resolve finally crumbling under the weight of the unnatural horrors he'd faced. Elliot and I moved alone through the twisting paths and stagnant pools, the journal tucked securely in Elliot's coat. The symbols carved into the trees were more frequent now, their jagged lines glowing faintly in the dim light. Each mark seemed to pulse with energy, as though it fed on the swamp itself. The eerie silence was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant croak of frogs, but even those natural sounds felt wrong, misplaced somehow. Elliot stopped suddenly, his head cocked to the side. "Do you hear that?" I froze, straining to catch whatever sound had drawn his attention. At first, there was nothing but the muffled whisper of the swamp, but then it came, the singing. Faint and haunting, it drifted through the air like smoke, curling around us with an almost tangible presence. "It's her," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Elliot nodded grimly. "She's leading us somewhere." We followed the sound, our pace cautious but steady. The swamp grew darker with every step, the canopy overhead blotting out what little sunlight remained. The singing grew louder, filling the air with its mournful melody, until finally, we reached another clearing. At the center stood a crude altar, constructed from twisted branches and moss-covered stones. Symbols like those carved into Louis' skin adorned the altar, their jagged lines glowing faintly in the dim light. The energy here was palpable, pressing against my chest like an invisible force. Elliot approached the altar with slow, deliberate movements, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. "This is it," he said finally. "This is where it ends." I stood frozen, my gaze fixed on the altar. The air seemed to hum with an unnatural charge, and the faint whispers of the singing echoed all around us. It was as if the swamp itself had come alive, its trees and water bearing witness to the rituals performed here. Suddenly, the singing stopped. Elliot straightened, his expression unreadable as the silence pressed down upon us. "Someone's been here," he said, his voice low but firm. "And they're coming back." Before I could respond, a sharp crack of wood echoed through the clearing. I spun around, my heart pounding as the shadows seemed to shift and writhe. The swamp was watching us again, its presence almost suffocating in its intensity. Elliot stepped closer to me, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "Stay sharp, Miguel," he said. "This is only the beginning." The swamp felt heavier that night, as if the air itself carried the weight of unseen eyes and unheard whispers. Despite the growing unease that wrapped itself around me like the damp humidity of Louisiana, Elliot's resolve seemed untouched, as unwavering as the moonlight breaking through the canopy above. His sharp gaze remained fixed on the altar ahead, where the faint symbols still pulsed and flickered with an unholy glow. I lingered at his side, gripping the strap of my bag tightly to steady my nerves. My role, as always, was to observe and assist, though tonight felt different, charged with a sense of impending revelation that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The journal, tucked securely in Elliot's coat, seemed to vibrate with some unseen energy, like a piece of history desperate to rewrite itself. "Whoever built this altar wasn't working alone," Elliot said suddenly, his tone breaking the suffocating silence. He stepped closer to the crude structure, his movements deliberate yet cautious, as though he feared waking the spirit that loomed over this place. I moved to follow, but my breath caught as the air seemed to shift around us. The stillness broke, subtle yet distinct, and for the first time, I felt the distinct impression that we were no longer alone. "You feel that?" I asked, though my voice came out quieter than intended. Elliot glanced back at me, his sharp expression betraying no surprise. "Stay sharp, Miguel," he muttered. "They're watching." I nodded, though the idea of unseen eyes crawling over my every movement sent a shiver coursing through my spine. My own instincts, honed more through education than the fieldwork Elliot had mastered, told me that whatever watched us from the shadows wasn't tethered to human limitations. The singing began again, faint at first, like a whisper carried on the breeze. But as it grew louder, swelling with the weight of sorrow and anguish, it wrapped itself around the clearing in a way that was both haunting and intoxicating. I froze, unable to move as the melody settled into my chest, compressing the air I desperately needed to breathe. "She's closer than before," Elliot said, his voice cutting through the sound like a lifeline. He turned toward me, his piercing gaze locking with mine. "Don't lose yourself to it." His words snapped me back to the present, breaking the trance that had momentarily overtaken me. I exhaled shakily and nodded, forcing my legs to carry me forward. Every step felt heavy, as though the swamp itself resisted our intrusion. Elliot crouched beside the altar, his hands moving deftly as he examined the carvings with a precision that bordered on reverence. "These markings, they're evolving," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "They weren't glowing like this before." I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening as I crouched beside him. "What does it mean?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. His fingers brushed over the jagged lines etched into the stones, tracing them like a path through the darkness. "She's preparing," he said finally, his voice low and grim. "For what?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. He didn't respond, but the gravity in his silence was enough to send my mind spinning with possibilities. My gaze flickered back to the trees surrounding the clearing, their twisted forms seeming to shift in the faint light. Shadows moved where no shadows should, and the oppressive stillness gave way to an unsettling rustle, like unseen figures shifting in anticipation. Elliot rose suddenly, his movements sharp and deliberate as he turned away from the altar. "We need answers," he said, his tone commanding. "Agnes Duval knows more than she's letting on." I hesitated, glancing back at the altar one last time. The symbols seemed to pulse more intensely now, their faint glow casting eerie patterns across the clearing. It wasn't just Willow's sorrow that hung heavy in the air, it was her rage, palpable and suffocating. Finding Agnes at her cabin proved more difficult than anticipated. The path through the swamp was darker now, the trees closing in around us like guardians protecting a secret we weren't meant to uncover. The singing followed us, faint and distant yet persistent, as though guiding us deeper into its domain. Elliot moved with purpose, his sharp gaze cutting through the darkness as he led the way. I struggled to keep pace, my own senses overwhelmed by the unnatural atmosphere that seemed to crawl over my skin like a living entity. Every snap of a twig or shift of shadow sent my pulse racing, but Elliot remained unwavering, his focus fixed on the task ahead. When we finally reached Agnes's cabin, the air felt heavier than ever, pressing against my chest like an invisible force. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so profound it was deafening. Elliot rapped sharply on the door, his movements brisk and commanding. "Agnes," he called, his voice firm but not unkind. "We need to speak." The door creaked open slowly, revealing the old woman's wiry frame. Her dark eyes glittered with an intelligence that seemed to pierce through the darkness surrounding us. She stepped aside without a word, allowing us to enter the dimly lit space. The cabin smelled of damp wood and dried herbs, its walls adorned with symbols and artifacts that spoke of rituals far older than Willow's tragic tale. Agnes moved to her worn chair near the fireplace, her movements deliberate yet heavy with resignation. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she said finally, her voice raspy but steady. Elliot nodded, his expression unreadable. "The altar. The carvings. The singing." Agnes sighed, her grip tightening on her walking stick. "It's her," she said simply. "Her sorrow. Her rage. It's in everything now." "You've known this would happen," Elliot said, his tone sharp but not accusatory. Agnes didn't deny it. Instead, she reached for a worn leather book on the table beside her, its cover cracked and faded with age. She handed it to Elliot, her hand trembling slightly. "Her story is written here," she said. "The full story. The one the town buried along with her." Elliot took the book carefully, his sharp gaze scanning the pages with practiced precision. His expression grew darker with each passing moment, the weight of Willow's tale settling over him like the swamp's oppressive air. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Agnes hesitated, her gaze flickering to the symbols carved into the walls. "She was betrayed," she said finally. "By the people she trusted most. And now, her sorrow ties them all to her pain." "Not just them," Elliot said, his voice low but firm. "Their descendants." Agnes nodded, her expression grim. "She sings for them," she said. "And when they hear her song, when they feel it, they're lost to her." The weight of her words settled over us like the damp air of the swamp, heavy and suffocating. Elliot's sharp gaze remained fixed on the book, his movements deliberate as he flipped through the pages. I stood frozen, my mind racing with the implications of what we'd learned. The singing began again, faint and haunting, yet unmistakable. It wrapped itself around the cabin, pressing against the walls like an unseen force. Agnes's grip on her walking stick tightened, her dark eyes locking with Elliot's. "You don't have much time," she said simply. Elliot nodded, his jaw set with determination. "We'll stop her." Agnes didn't respond, but the weight in her silence was enough to send a shiver coursing through my spine. And as the singing swelled, filling the air with its mournful melody, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being drawn into something far greater and far more dangerous than we had ever imagined. The swamp stretched out before us like an endless maze, its twisted trees reaching skyward like skeletal hands. The cabin's flickering light had long since faded behind us, swallowed by the encroaching darkness as we pressed deeper into the heart of Willow's domain. Though Elliot moved with deliberate purpose, I couldn't ignore the weight pressing against my chest, the growing sense of unease that had seeped into my very bones. The singing began again, faint and fractured, carrying with it the mournful longing of a soul trapped in eternal sorrow. Every note seemed to resonate within the swamp itself, vibrating through the stagnant pools of water and curling around the branches overhead. My breathing quickened as the melody grew louder, its haunting beauty both intoxicating and terrifying. "Stay close," Elliot murmured, his sharp gaze cutting through the shadows ahead. I followed without hesitation, though each step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself resisted our intrusion. The journal tucked in Elliot's coat seemed almost alive, pulsating with an unseen energy that mirrored the rhythm of Willow's song. I couldn't help but feel as though we were crossing a threshold into something we could never fully understand, something ancient, dangerous, and unyielding. The clearing emerged suddenly, as if pulled into existence by the singing. Moonlight spilled through the tangled canopy, illuminating the altar in its haunting glow. The jagged carvings etched into the stones pulsed faintly, their glow stronger now, alive with Willow's anguish. Elliot approached cautiously, his movements deliberate but steady, like a man navigating a labyrinth of razor-thin edges. I hung back, unwilling to step closer to the altar despite the faint pull it exerted on my chest. The air felt charged with electricity, the kind that prickled along my skin and made every hair stand on end. Willow's presence wasn't just palpable, it was consuming, wrapping itself around the clearing like an invisible shroud. "Look at this," Elliot said, his voice cutting through the singing as he crouched beside the stones. I stepped forward, hesitant yet compelled, and saw the fresh carvings in the altar's surface. They formed intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with meaning, their jagged lines holding a sinister beauty. It wasn't just the work of a ritual, it was a masterpiece of despair, a testament to Willow's pain. "These markings," Elliot continued, his tone sharp with realization, "they're completing the sequence. Someone's finishing her work." I felt my chest tighten, the weight of his words settling over me like the swamp's oppressive air. "What happens when it's finished?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Elliot didn't respond immediately. His fingers traced the edges of the carvings, his sharp mind dissecting every detail. "She'll rise," he said finally, his voice grim but steady. "And she won't stop." The sound of footsteps pulled me from the gravity of his words. It was faint at first, barely audible over the singing, but it grew louder, closer, until the shadows themselves seemed to shift and move. My breathing quickened as I scanned the darkness, my pulse hammering against my ribcage. Elliot rose slowly, his gaze fixed on the shifting shadows ahead. "We're not alone," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The figure emerged from the darkness like a spectre, its movement slow and deliberate. It was a man, his frame wiry and hunched, his face obscured by the brim of a tattered hat. His clothes hung from his body like rags, soaked and torn by the swamp's relentless grip. But it was his eyes that stopped me, the way they glittered with an unnatural light, sharp and predatory. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice rough and guttural, like rocks grinding together. Elliot didn't flinch, his piercing gaze locked on the man. "Neither should you," he replied, his tone steady but unyielding. The man smiled faintly, though the expression carried no warmth. "I belong here," he said simply. "This is my home." The words hung heavy in the air, wrapping themselves around the clearing like a noose. I felt my breath catch as the man stepped closer, his movements deliberate yet unsettling. He carried with him the weight of the swamp itself, as though he had been born from its depths and molded by its darkness. Elliot's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You've been finishing the sequence, haven't you?" The man's smile widened, though it remained devoid of humanity. "I've only done what she asked," he said, his tone almost reverent. "What she needed." My stomach churned as the implication settled in. This man wasn't just connected to Willow's curse, he was an extension of it, a vessel for her anguish and rage. "You don't understand," the man continued, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "She was betrayed. Hanged for sins that weren't hers. And now, she sings for justice." Elliot stepped forward, his imposing presence cutting through the man's reverence. "Justice," he said sharply. "This isn't justice, it's vengeance." The man's eyes narrowed, their unnatural light flickering like a dying flame. "And what's wrong with vengeance?" he asked, his tone venomous. "She deserves it. She deserves to make them suffer, just as they made her suffer." The word sent a chill coursing through me, but Elliot remained unshaken. "Who made her suffer?" he pressed, his tone sharp and commanding. The man hesitated, his gaze flickering to the glowing altar. "Them," he said finally, his voice heavy with contempt. "Their bloodlines. Their descendants. They all carry the stain of her betrayal." The singing swelled suddenly, filling the clearing with its mournful beauty. It wrapped itself around us like an invisible force, compressing the air and tightening my chest. The man stepped closer to the altar, his movement slow and deliberate, and placed his hand on its surface. "She's almost ready," he said simply, his tone carrying a kind of reverence that made my stomach turn. "Her sorrow is stronger now. Her rage is stronger." Elliot moved closer, his sharp gaze fixed on the man. "And when she rises?" he asked. The man smiled faintly, his eyes glittering with unnatural light. "Then you'll see," he said. "You'll understand." The words hung heavy in the air, their weight pressing against my chest like a vice. The symbols on the altar pulsed with increasing intensity, their glow casting eerie patterns across the clearing. Willow's presence was almost tangible now, her anguish wrapping itself around us like an invisible shroud. Elliot turned to me, his piercing gaze locking with mine. "We have to stop this," he said, his tone steady but commanding. I nodded, though my legs felt weak beneath me. The weight of what we faced pressed against my very soul, but I knew Elliot's resolve would carry us forward. And as the singing swelled, filling the swamp with its mournful melody, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the precipice of something far greater and far more dangerous than we had ever imagined. The swamp swallowed us whole as we plunged deeper into its darkness, following the faint trail of disturbed earth and twisted branches left behind by the enigmatic man who had disappeared into the shadows. My breath came in shallow bursts, and the moist air clung to my lungs like tar. Even Elliot, unshakable in his resolve, seemed to carry an edge of tension in his usually measured steps. The singing had faded again, though its absence didn't offer relief. Instead, silence ruled the swamp, oppressive and alive with unspeakable intent. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of wood or splash of water against the muddy banks, felt amplified, echoing like ghostly murmurs of a past unwilling to remain buried. My fingers grazed the strap of my satchel, as if clutching something familiar might tether me in this vast, unknowable gloom. Elliot stopped abruptly, holding a hand up to signal me to do the same. He cocked his head, listening. I strained my ears to follow his lead, but the silence was too thick, too absolute. "What is it?" I whispered, barely daring to let my voice disturb the air. Elliot's eyes narrowed. "Footsteps," he murmured, pointing toward the faintly glowing altar we had left minutes earlier. "Behind us." The words froze the blood in my veins. We had seen no one in the swamp except the man and Agnes, both players in Willow's Lament, yes, but seemingly unaccompanied. Yet the swamp's malevolence felt vast enough to contain any number of conspirators, seen or unseen. I turned, my boots sinking into the damp, spongy ground as I peered back into the swirling shadows. My pulse thundered in my ears as my imagination painted horrors within the black, shapes that did not exist, until I saw one that did. Elliot's sharp whisper came as I stumbled a step back. "Stay with me, Miguel. Don't lose focus." In the gloom, between the curtain of moss-draped trees, a figure moved. It was quick, darting between the trunks with an unnatural grace, too fluid to belong to anything human. My hand shot out instinctively, gripping Elliot's arm tighter than I probably should have. "There's something there." Elliot followed my line of sight, his expression hardening. He adjusted his coat, where I knew he kept his revolver, though he rarely resorted to using it. "I see it." "Stay close." We pressed forward, the oppressive silence of the swamp now ruptured by faint, intermittent noises, movement, whispers carried by an errant breeze, and once, the distinct splash of water too deliberate to be natural. Whoever, or whatever, followed us, it wasn't content to simply observe. The path shifted, narrowing to a snaking corridor hemmed in by tall reeds that bent ominously toward us like conspirators leaning in to share a secret. My skin prickled with the growing sense of being funneled toward something unseen yet inevitable, and I could tell Elliot felt it too by the way his movements grew sharper, more urgent. We emerged into another clearing, though this one lacked the haunting majesty of the altar's glade. Here, the land was uneven and fractured, the earth broken and heaving upward as though the swamp itself had rebelled against what had transpired. A small pond sat at its center, the water inky black and undisturbed save for faint ripples that spread outward in a rhythmic pulse. Something about it drew the eye, an unnatural stillness that demanded attention even as every instinct screamed to look away. Elliot moved toward the pond with measured steps, his gaze darting around the clearing. "This place, it's a focal point." "For what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. He didn't respond, but as he reached the edge of the pond, his expression darkened. The water, beneath its glassy surface, revealed shapes that should not have been visible, faces distorted by agony, hands reaching upward as if clawing toward escape. I felt my knees weaken at the sight, and it took everything in me not to turn and run. "Her rage anchors here," Elliot said, his voice low and grim. "This is where it happened." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak despite the lump in my throat. "You mean this is where they—" Elliot nodded, his eyes scanning the water. "This is where Willow was hanged. And drowned." The singing returned, not faint or distant as before, but loud and all-encompassing, reverberating through the clearing with a power that seemed to shake the very trees. I staggered back, clutching at my ears as the sound pierced through me like shards of glass. It wasn't just sorrow in the melody this time, it was fury, raw and unyielding. Elliot stood firm, though I saw his jaw clench against the pressure of the song. He turned toward me, his voice sharp and commanding. "Miguel, focus. Remember the journal." The journal. I fumbled with my satchel, my hands trembling as I retrieved the worn leather tome. Its presence felt heavier now, as though it, too, responded to the singing. Flipping through the pages, I found the section Elliot had referenced earlier, the sequence of symbols that mirrored those carved into the altar. But as I read, new lines revealed themselves, ink bleeding across the page as if written by an invisible hand. "It's changing," I stammered, my voice barely audible over the singing. "The text, it's showing us something new." Elliot moved to my side, his gaze locking on the page. His eyes narrowed as he studied the shifting symbols. "It's a counter-ritual," he said, his voice tinged with both revelation and urgency. "A way to break the cycle." Before I could respond, the ground beneath us shuddered, a deep rumble that seemed to emanate from the pond itself. The ripples intensified, and the inky water began to churn as if alive. From its depths, a shape emerged, a figure cloaked in shadow, its form indistinct but undeniably human. Willow. Her presence was overwhelming, an aura of anguish and fury that pressed against my very soul. The singing poured from her, though her lips did not move, a spectral symphony that threatened to consume everything in its path. Her eyes, hollow and blazing with an unnatural light, locked onto us with a gaze that felt like a physical force. Elliot stepped forward, his hand raised in a gesture of calm. "Willow," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the song. "We're here to end this." The apparition paused, her head tilting slightly as if considering his words. But the singing did not stop, and the pressure in the air grew heavier, more suffocating. I clutched the journal tightly, the symbols blurring before my eyes as the weight of her presence pressed down on me. "She doesn't want to listen," I managed, my voice strained. Elliot's gaze remained fixed on her. "She doesn't need to listen," he said. "She needs to be freed." The pond erupted, water cascading into the air as Willow's form surged toward us, her fury manifesting in a whirlwind of shadow and sound. Elliot grabbed my arm, pulling me back as the ground beneath us cracked and heaved. "Read it," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. I fumbled with the journal, forcing my eyes to focus on the shifting text. The counter-ritual was there, its lines forming a sequence of words and symbols that seemed to burn themselves into my mind. I began to speak, my voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each syllable. Willow's form writhed and contorted, the shadows around her thickening as the ritual's words filled the air. The symbols on the journal began to glow, their light piercing through the darkness like a beacon. Elliot stood firm beside me, his presence a steady anchor as the storm of rage and sorrow swirled around us. As the final words left my lips, the singing faltered, the melody breaking apart like shards of glass. Willow's form froze, her blazing eyes locking onto mine for one haunting moment before the shadows consumed her, and the clearing fell silent. The swamp exhaled. The oppressive weight that had clung to the air lifted, replaced by a stillness that felt almost peaceful. I staggered, my legs threatening to give out beneath me, and Elliot caught my arm to steady me. "It's done," he said, his voice low but resolute. But as I looked at the pond, now calm and still once more, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had only begun to uncover the true depth of Willow's lament. The clearing lay quiet in the aftermath, the swamp seemingly holding its breath. Willow's shadow had vanished into the ether, and the song that had clung to the air like a curse was gone. Yet, the silence felt anything but peaceful, unnerving in its stillness, as if the swamp itself was deliberating what came next. My legs trembled beneath me, every muscle on edge as I clutched the journal tightly, the faint glow of the symbols fading from its pages like the final embers of a dying fire. Elliot remained still, his piercing gaze locked on the pond where Willow had risen. The water had settled, its surface smooth and reflective, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something lurked just beneath it, something that had seen us, marked us. "She's gone," I managed, though my voice was far from steady. Elliot shook his head slowly, his jaw set tight as his attention remained fixed on the pond. "Not gone," he said. "Not yet." The weight of his words pressed down on me, heavier than the suffocating humidity that clung to the swamp. Though Willow's apparition had disappeared, her sorrow lingered, palpable and consuming. It was more than grief, it was fury, raw and unrelenting, etched into the air like the carvings that had adorned the altar. I forced myself to move, stepping closer to Elliot despite the ache in my legs and the unease tightening my chest. "What now?" I asked, though I feared the answer. Elliot turned his gaze to me, his sharp eyes flickering with the intensity of a man on the brink of revelation. "Now," he said, "we end it." The journal burned in my hands as we retraced our steps through the swamp, the path twisting and shifting beneath our feet as if fighting to keep us away from the altar. The symbols on its pages seemed to writhe like living entities, their jagged lines pulsating with an energy that mirrored the swamp's oppressive atmosphere. It wasn't just a book anymore, it was a piece of Willow herself, infused with her sorrow and rage. Elliot moved with relentless determination, his movements deliberate yet urgent as he led the way. I followed close behind, the weight of the journal pressing against my chest like a stone. The shadows seemed darker now, the swamp alive with unseen eyes and unheard whispers. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent my pulse racing, yet Elliot remained unwavering, his focus unshaken. The altar came into view suddenly, its eerie glow casting long shadows across the clearing. The carvings on its surface pulsed with renewed vigor, their jagged lines alive with meaning as they awaited the final stroke to complete their sequence. Willow's presence pressed down on us, suffocating in its intensity, though her form remained absent. Elliot approached the altar cautiously, his sharp gaze scanning the symbols with the precision of a man piecing together a puzzle. I hung back, my breathing shallow as I clutched the journal tightly, its pages heavy with the weight of the counter-ritual. "She needs closure," Elliot said suddenly, his voice low but steady. "She needs her story to be told." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "And if we fail?" Elliot's gaze locked onto mine, his expression hard and resolute. "We don't fail." The symbols on the altar began to glow brighter as Elliot began the ritual, his voice steady but commanding as he recited the lines from the journal. The air in the clearing grew heavy, charged with an energy that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. I joined him, my voice trembling at first but gaining strength with each word. The singing returned, not faint or haunting as before, but loud and piercing, its melody wrapping around us like an invisible force. It was Willow's lament, her sorrow given form and power, and it threatened to consume everything in its path. I staggered back, clutching my ears as the sound tore through me, but Elliot remained firm, his voice cutting through the song like a blade. "Focus, Miguel," he shouted over the cacophony. "We're almost there." I forced myself to stand, drawing strength from Elliot's resolve as I continued the ritual. The symbols on the altar pulsed with intensity, their jagged lines glowing like fire as the ritual approached its climax. Willow's presence pressed down on us, suffocating in its fury, but we pressed on, our voices rising above her song. The ground beneath us shuddered violently, cracks spreading across the earth like veins as the swamp itself seemed to recoil. Willow's apparition began to take shape above the altar, her form wreathed in shadow and light. Her blazing eyes locked onto us, filled with a sorrow and rage that threatened to tear the world apart. "Speak her name," Elliot shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Willow Fournier," I cried, my voice trembling but clear. "We hear you." The apparition froze, her blazing eyes flickering as the words hung heavy in the air. The song faltered, its piercing melody breaking apart like shards of glass. The swamp fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting as Willow's form began to fade. Elliot stepped forward, his voice steady and commanding. "Your story has been told," he said. "Your sorrow has been heard. Let go, Willow. Let go." The shadows around her swirled, their edges softening as her form dissolved into the ether. Her presence lingered for one haunting moment before the air exhaled, the oppressive weight lifting to reveal a stillness that felt almost peaceful. The altar's glow faded, its carvings dimming until only jagged lines remained. The swamp, once alive with fury and sorrow, fell quiet, its oppressive atmosphere replaced by a sense of calm. "It's done," Elliot said, his voice low but resolute. I nodded, though my legs threatened to give out beneath me. The weight of what we had faced settled over me like the damp air of the swamp, but there was relief in knowing that Willow's lament had finally ended. As we turned to leave the clearing, the faint echoes of her song lingered in the air, a reminder of the sorrow and rage that had consumed her. But it was no longer a lament, it was a requiem, a final farewell to a soul that had been bound to pain for far too long. And as the swamp exhaled, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been witnesses to something far greater and far more haunting than we could ever understand. The swamp seemed to retreat in the days that followed, withdrawing its shadowy grip like a living thing weary of holding on. Though the oppressive heaviness had lifted, its absence didn't bring relief. The air was still damp with tension, and the sunlight that pierced through the canopy felt hollow, as though it illuminated a place that shouldn't exist at all. I hadn't slept, and judging by Elliot's taut expression, neither had he. Each moment outside the clearing where Willow's lament ended felt unreal, disconnected from everything we'd endured. The swamp remained unmoving, but its silence was not of peace, it carried whispers of the unspoken and unresolved, a murmur just beyond understanding. Elliot sat at the small wooden table in the Cypress Hollow Inn, the journal spread before him like a relic demanding reckoning. His movements were precise as he examined its pages, even as exhaustion pulled at his features. The book seemed quiet now, its one shifting text finally still, yet the weight of its existence hadn't faded. "We're missing something," Elliot said quietly, almost to himself. His voice was steady, but it carried an edge of doubt I rarely heard from him. I leaned against the doorframe, unable to quell the unease curling within my chest. "You think she's still here?" The question felt absurd, but after everything we'd seen, the line between disbelief and reality had long since blurred. Elliot's gaze flicked up to meet mine, sharp as a blade. "It's not about whether she's here, it's about what she left behind." The sheriff came by later that morning, looking worse than before. His usual bravado had been stripped away, leaving behind a man who seemed haunted in a way words couldn't describe. He hesitated in the doorway before speaking, his voice brittle. "They're still hearing it," he said. "That damn singing." The words froze the air in the room. I felt my chest tighten as the faint melody echoed in my mind, uninvited and unwelcome. Elliot didn't flinch, his piercing gaze fixed on Fontaine with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. "Where?" he demanded. "Near the church," Fontaine replied, his tone desperate. "Late at night. Folks are scared to even step outside." I exchanged a glance with Elliot, but his expression remained unreadable. "We'll handle it," he said simply, rising from his seat. The church sat at the edge of Cypress Hollow, its modest structure dwarfed by the looming trees that surrounded it. The air was thick with quiet anticipation, heavy but not oppressive, as we approached. Though the swamp seemed to have receded from its maddening grip, its presence lingered in a way that was inescapable. Elliot led the way, his strides confident as he carried the journal under his arm like an offering. The faint notes of Willow's song hung in the air, barely audible but unmistakable. It was different now, not the mournful lament that had consumed the swamp, but something softer, gentler. I felt my pulse quicken as the melody pulled at me, twisting through the shadows like a thread leading deeper into the unknown. Inside the church, the air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of aged wood and candle wax. The pews were empty, but their polished surfaces bore the marks of countless hands, a testament to the lives that had once sought solace here. Willow's presence was faint but tangible, an echo lingering just beyond reach. Elliot stopped in the aisle, his sharp gaze scanning the room with the precision of a predator. The journal remained closed in his grip, though I could sense its weight pressing against him. "She came here," he murmured. This place, it meant something to her. I swallowed hard, my chest tight with apprehension. Why would she come here? Elliot turned to me, his expression dark with thought. Regret. Hope. Anguish. Maybe all three. The singing grew louder as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the church in shadow. It seemed to rise from the very walls, each note vibrating with an aching beauty that defied explanation. I felt the weight of it settle over me, pressing down like the swamp had in its darkest moments. Elliot moved toward the altar, his steps deliberate but slow, as though he feared disturbing the stillness. He set the journal down carefully, its cover gleaming faintly in the dim light, and opened it to the final pages. The once shifting text remained still, but its presence carried an intensity that felt almost alive. She wanted to be free, he said quietly, his voice steady but heavy. But freedom is never simple. Not for someone like her. I stepped closer, my pulse quickening as I scanned the pages. The text was clear now, its jagged symbols forming lines that held undeniable meaning. It wasn't just a story, it was a final confession, written in sorrow and rage, etched into the fabric of the swamp itself. She asked for justice, I murmured, the weight of the words pressing against me. But she never found peace. Elliot nodded, his jaw tight. And she won't find it unless we give it to her. The air in the church shifted suddenly, charged with an energy that felt both foreign and familiar. Willow's song rose, filling the space with its haunting melody, and I felt my knees weaken beneath its weight. It was no longer sorrow, it was a plea, raw and unrelenting, demanding recognition. Elliot stood firm, his gaze locked on the altar. He opened the journal to the final page, its text glowing faintly as the melody swirled around us. I couldn't move, frozen in place as Willow's presence pressed down on me like an invisible force. Elliot's voice cut through the song, sharp and commanding. Willow Fournier, he said, his tone steady. Your story is known. Your pain is understood. Let this place be your sanctuary. The song faltered, its melody breaking apart like shards of glass. Willow's presence seemed to shift, her anguish softening as the weight of her sorrow lifted. I felt the air exhale, releasing the tension that had gripped the church, and the room fell silent. The journal's glow faded, its jagged text dimming until only blank pages remained. The oppressive weight of the swamp had lifted, replaced by a stillness that felt almost peaceful. I staggered, my breathing uneven as the reality of what would face settled over me. It's done, Elliot said, his voice low but resolute. She's finally free. I nodded, though the echoes of Willow's song lingered in my mind, a haunting reminder of the depths of human sorrow. As we left the church, the swamp seemed to recede further, its oppressive presence replaced by an air of calm. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that Willow's story would remain with me forever, a reminder of the shadowy depths of human nature and the haunting consequences of tampering with the unknown. The swamp stretched out before us as the morning sun finally broke through the tangled canopy, illuminating Cypress Hollow with a glow it hadn't seen for weeks. It wasn't just the light, it was the air, cleaner and lighter than before, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and promise. The heaviness that had anchored the town to Willow's pain had lifted, leaving behind a strange but unmistakable sense of renewal. And yet, I couldn't stop the faint, lingering echo of her song that had woven itself into my thoughts. Elliot stood by the church steps, his coat draped loosely over his shoulders as he leaned against one of the weathered columns. He wasn't one to bask in moments of stillness, but even he seemed quietly contemplative as he gazed out toward the horizon. The journal rested beside him, its once glowing text now faded to blank pages, a silent testament to the trials we had endured. "She's gone," Elliot said finally, his voice steady but thoughtful. It wasn't a question, more of an acknowledgement, like he was speaking to the swamp itself. I stepped closer, my boots crunching lightly against the gravel path that cut through the grass. "Do you think she found peace?" The words felt heavy, though I couldn't help but ask. Elliot glanced at me, his sharp gaze softening just slightly. "If nothing else, she's free. Whether that's peace or something else, it's her choice now." I nodded, though the faint echo of her song still lingered in my chest like a distant memory. Her sorrow had left its mark, not just on Cypress Hollow, but on me, on Elliot, on the very air we breathed. And yet, there was relief in knowing her story had been told, her pain understood. The sheriff arrived before noon, his face lined with exhaustion but carrying an air of cautious optimism. He didn't need to say much, just a brief nod as he approached, his hat pulled low over his face. Fontaine wasn't the kind of man to offer gratitude, but the absence of his usual curt demeanor spoke volumes. "No singing last night," he said simply, his voice rough but steady. "Town's been quiet. First time in a long while." Elliot nodded, his expression unreadable as always. "It won't come back." Fontaine exhaled, his shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. "And the people? What do I tell them?" Elliot didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Tell them to remember," he said finally. "Not just her pain, but the part they played in it." The sheriff seemed taken aback, his brow furrowing as he considered Elliot's words. But he nodded, tipping his hat as he turned to leave, the weight of responsibility resting heavily on his shoulders. We spent the rest of the day walking through the town, though the swamp was never far from view. Its looming trees seemed less foreboding now, their twisted branches no longer oppressive but merely part of the landscape. The people of Cypress Hollow moved cautiously, their eyes darting toward the swamp as though expecting it to surge back to life. But as the hours passed, the town began to breathe again, its rhythm slowly returning. At the edge of the swamp, Agnes Duval waited, her wiry frame hunched but resolute. She didn't look surprised to see us, her dark eyes glittering with that sharp, knowing intelligence that had unsettled me from the start. "She's gone, isn't she?" Agnes asked, her voice raspy but steady. Elliot nodded. "The swamp will heal. But her mark will remain." Agnes sighed, her grip tightening on her walking stick. "The swamp remembers," she said, echoing her earlier words. "And so should they." We returned to the inn as the sun began to set, its golden light casting long shadows across the wooden walls. The journal rested on the table, its blank pages gleaming faintly in the fading light. Elliot sat across from it, his sharp gaze locked on its cover as though it might suddenly spring to life again. "What happens now?" I asked, breaking the silence. Elliot glanced at me, his expression contemplative. "The town moves on. The swamp grows quiet. And we leave." I frowned, though I knew he was right. Cypress Hollow wasn't a place for people like us, those who sought answers in the shadowy depths of the unknown. We had told Willow's story, released her from the pain that had bound her, and now it was time for the town to write its own. As the final traces of sunlight disappeared below the horizon, I felt a strange sense of closure settle over me. Willow's lament had ended, her sorrow no longer tethered to the swamp, and yet her story would remain. Not as a haunting melody, but as a quiet reminder of the human cost of betrayal and the fragile thread that binds justice and vengeance. Elliot rose suddenly, his movements deliberate but relaxed as he draped his coat over his shoulders. He turned toward me, his sharp gaze carrying that faint flicker of something resembling satisfaction. "Let's go," he said simply. And as we left Cypress Hollow behind, the swamp receding into the distance, I felt the faintest echo of Willow's song, soft, gentle, and finally free. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey through the Lament of Black Willow. With the shadows receding and Willow finally finding peace, this tale leaves us with haunting echoes of sorrow and redemption. But remember, the swamp and its secrets will forever linger in our minds. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to Bookbound Audio for more thrilling tales. Don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay updated, because the next story promises to pull you deeper into the world of mystery and imagination. Until then, stay curious and keep listening.